Our previous video led us to using a line master to segment each line of dialogue into different pieces, joined together by input receivers. This allowed us to combine what would previously require several lines of dialogue into one easier and more efficient line. But today we're expanding the line master to incorporate events alongside of our useful segmenters. As we discussed, an event will be a type of data inside dialogue that either acts as an injection target or a type of instruction. Currently, we use curly brackets to identify segmenters, while TM-Pro, the text system we're using, uses the alligator brackets for tags, so we need another form of delimiters so as to not interfere with those two. Let's use regular brackets for events, because if dialogue is used, brackets won't generally be used. If anything, parentheses would be used inside of dialogue, so we should be safe using these forms of encapsulators. Let's make a line in our chapter file to test out events. Sometimes you might want to change the speed of text generation, and this would be an instruction passed in during dialogue to show what part should occur faster or slower. So let's add a text speed event inside of brackets. I give the name text speed and then pass in a variable for the delay between characters, as well as how many characters are shown per frame. This event is inside of the brackets, so I know it's not part of the normal dialogue. Notice in this case, the data accompanying the event is separated by a space and then delimited with a comma. This is how I'll interpret each event if it passes in data, and then maybe terminate it to return to normal speed. That's an idea of what we can do with events. But this is an instruction set, and there's another type of event that we could use that would be a simple injection target. When I say injection target, I'm referring to a piece of text to be replaced with a value of some sort, be it a name of a character, place, or item, a number perhaps, anything really, anything that can be injected. In this case, I'll call for the injection of whatever the player named their character. This will require a tag specific to the main character name contained inside of the brackets. Then let's slow down the text to delay each character by 15 frames and show 2 characters per frame. So we want to find that really interesting slow-moving slug for some reason. Must be a cool slug. And then let's terminate that. Then use a segmenter to append a new line after the user input. And then let's tell the player to bring a special item like their current holy relic or something. So we've got both types of events here, injections and instructions. Now we just have to make them work. So when an injection takes place, this tag will be located and replaced with whatever the main character's name is. Let's just say it's Avira. Likewise, the item tag will be located and replaced with the proper name. Let's say the Divine Arc. I don't even know what that is, but it sounds legit, so I'm using it. And we'll be handling all of this inside of the run function of our segments, since that's where text formation takes place anyway. Now remember, this is in the CLM class. So let's go in there and find our segment. So in our running function, we should take care of injection first, but we don't take those targets to be instructions. And this will be done with our trusty tag manager we made a while back. So open the tag manager in your scripting platform from Unity. And let's make a new public static function called inject that'll reference a string. Remember that referencing a value allows you to change the variable that contains the value, so we can return void instead of a string here. Now we only want to inject if the string contains a bracket. Otherwise, we know there's no injection target, and we shouldn't even try to find one. If that's not the case, then we should replace any present tags with their corresponding values. We're just going to use string.replace for this, since there's no issue whether a tag is present or not. And when the main character tag is found, I replace it with Avira. Now, the name wouldn't be static like this. Otherwise, there's not much benefit. Instead, you would load the name from some type of data container. Say we have game data, and in it is the main character's name, saved from when the user first defined it. We could load it from that to bring what the player created into our dialogue. Maybe you've got several game files, and you want to get the name from the currently loaded file, or something like that. But I have nothing of the sort, so I'm just adding a static string of Avira. Next, we had the current holy relic, so I will replace that with Divine Arc. Or you could load it from inventory.currentHolyRelic or something like that. With the injection function complete, we can call it from our run sequence before anything else happens. Reference our dialogue, since that's what we want to inject data into. And that will clear out injection events, leaving us only with whatever instruction events may be left in the dialogue. And as was mentioned, events are encapsulated within the square brackets, so if we split the dialogue by those, we get each piece of dialogue and its instruction. So create a string array as the output of splitting our dialogue by those event brackets. And then iterate through each one using a for loop. Just like we did for segmenters and segments, our events will always be odd indexed, so we should determine if that's the case with a boolean. If this current part is odd indexed, then we know it's an event and it should be handled with special care. Let's make a script specifically for handling dialogue events. And you know what? I will even call it dialogue events just to keep it simple. Inside, we can remove start and update, and everything is going to be static, so we won't actually need to place this on a game object. Make a function called handleEvent that takes in both a string for the event, as well as a segment the event belongs to. The segment, of course, deriving from the line class of our chapter line manager. We need a reference to the segment because most events will directly affect the segment that contains them, such as with altering text speed by using the architect. And the format of an event is the event name followed by a space separating the data from the name, so we should split the event by the space character to get the name and data separately. And this next part should look very familiar. Let's handle events like we did with the actions of our novel controller, using a switch based off of the event name to determine what action to take. My focus is the text speed event, so I'll have a case for that as well as the terminator, which will simply reset the speed. Now we're going to need the actual function to call if this event is found. So let's make a static void and just call it something like event text speed. It should take the data of the event as well as the event segment. And now we can call it from the case above and pass in the proper parameters. Before we go on, we need to know the format of the data as well. It takes two values, the first being the delay between characters, and then the number of characters revealed per cycle. Each is delimited by a comma, as is standard with this. So knowing that, we know we'll have to split the data by the comma character, and then parse each value to get the data in its proper form. So let's go ahead and do that right now, and split that string by the delimiter. And our delay is a float, so get it by parsing the first element as a float. The number of characters per cycle is an integer, so I'll use int.parse for that one. Now we can just change the speed and characters per frame of the segment's architect to these values. But right now those variables are private within the architect, so we'll need to open it up and either make them public or add a method to assign them publicly. And we are free to assign the values and change our architect. And that's all we need for that event, but let's not forget about the termination. All that needs to do is change the speed and the character limit back to 1, and that essentially resets the architect to its default speed. And with that we have two working events. So if the part of our segment is odd, then it's an event, and we should pass management to the dialog events handler. Give it the current part as the event, and this instance as the segment. Then we should increment I by 1 to advance the next even piece of dialogue. So let's take this portion of code where we initiate the dialogue and wait for it to finish, and use it for each piece of dialogue above. Cut it and paste it in our loop. Then get the current dialogue as our target, and use that in place of the whole dialogue. Now that we're splitting a single segment into multiple pieces of dialogue, it's important to remember that they should all display as though it's a single say method, meaning they should be stitched together in the same dialog box or become additive to one another. So any piece after the first should automatically be additive, but the first element should only be additive if it uses pre-existing text. Check the value of I to determine this. If it's above 0, then it should automatically be additive. But when we run this line through Unity, we encounter a hiccup. The injection targets have disappeared. We neither have Avira nor the name of her weapon, or even the event tags themselves. And that's because s.replace returns a string, so it should be reassigned to s. So the events remained and then were split and attempted to be handled like instructions, which is why they disappeared from the text. Rerunning this in Unity should now give us the proper injections. As you can see, they both work correctly, but our text speed didn't work at all. The reason text speed didn't work is because with each say method we initiate from the dialog system, a new text architect is created, so the values assigned to the old one disappear as the new one is generated and brought forth. To fix this, we have to add a simple fix to the actual dialog system that lets us reuse the same text architect over and over again, resulting in changes from one piece carrying over into another. So right here where we say text architect equals a new instance, we should only do this if the text architect is currently null. Create it one time and then keep reusing it, in other words. So only if it's null will we create a new architect. Otherwise, we need to perform a renewal. So enter the architect and go all the way down to the bottom, where we'll create a new public function to renew the architect. When we renew it, it'll expect a new target string to display, as well as a potential pre-text field for additive use or not. Assign the target of the architect and the pre-text as well. Then make sure we reset skip to false. Since we're reusing, we have to take these considerations into account now. Next, if we're currently constructing, terminate the process. And then initiate a new build process. And go back into the dialog system and call renew on the existing architect. And give it the new target and additive text. Then let's run the text speed event where we mention our interestingly slow slug, and watch it work in Unity. There we go. Nice. The text slowed down, and then reset to normal speed with the events in our dialogue. But now we've got something else to incorporate. As is, if we want to execute an action, we have to call it at the end of a line, and it'll only happen once all of the dialogue of a line is finished. Now, unfortunately, that means that all segments of a line must finish before any action can occur, and sad to say, I do not like that. Instead, how about we add actions inside of our dialogue, so they can occur with the completion of words or individual segments. To make this work, we can call an action exactly as we would at the end of a line, but inside of the dialogue as long as the action is inside of event brackets. So the event handler will interpret this event as an action and pass it over to the novel controller to execute it. We can segregate actions from instructions by checking if the event contains parentheses. Since instructions only use commas, but actions use parentheses and commas, we can check and only handle it as an action if the check is true. And to make it better, why not allow multiple actions separated by spaces, just like it would be outside of the dialogue? So we can use dialogue to trigger actions very easily if we do it this way. Just loop through each action and throw it to the novel controller using the handle action function. But surprisingly enough, that function is not publicly accessible, so we just need to make sure that it is. Let's go back into the Nova controller, and it's quite near the bottom, right before all the actions take place. Void handle action should now be public void handle action. And now we can use it. And give it the action. So if this event was an action, return so we don't bother trying to use it as an instruction. And then our action will execute once it's reached in the dialogue, and that's pretty good. To show multiple actions, I'll transition the background to a forest as well as play a sound effect within the same event. Alright, brilliant. Works like a charm. Now we've got a new issue to deal with, since we're splitting up segments, and that comes from when we force finish a segment. See how when I force finish this segment, it only completes up to the first event? But when we click, it advances to the next segment even though the previous one isn't fully formed? That's because the force finish completes the current target of the text architect, which only goes as far as the dialogue preceding the next event in the segment. So with each auto advance, the target text gets bigger in the architect, but force finishing stops it before the final target is actually reached. So we wind up finishing the current text, which is only part of the whole segment. Instead, we need to gather all of the dialogue in the entire segment and assign that to the architect. But since actions are contained inside the dialogue now, we also need to execute any events that haven't occurred yet, so we don't skip something that might be important. So let's go into the segment of our CLM where force finish is. But before we do anything, we need to make a list of currently executed events so we don't perform the same ones if force finish is called after an action but before the whole dialogue is formed. We don't want to do the same thing twice. And this list will just be a list of strings that will clear on the start of the run process and populate with each event as it's sent to the dialogue event handler. Now let's enter the force finish down here. And we only do all of this if the architect is not null, which it should never be, but just in case. Let's start with a string that'll represent the entire finished dialogue. Then split the dialogue from the events, just like we did above. Now loop through each item. Once more, let's get the odd indexed events and handle them separately from the regular dialogue. But we should only handle events that are not in our currently executed list. This will prevent us from executing doubles. If this event was already executed, just remove it from the list. If it wasn't, then pass it to the event handler. And increment I so we move to the next bit of dialogue. Add this dialogue to the whole dialogue, and that'll start building the entire segment string into one piece of text. Then we need to force the text architect to show this dialogue instead of its current target. We'll need to create a function for that, so we'll head over to the text architect after that line. Beneath renew, let's make a function called showText that'll take a single string to display on its connected TMPro object. Stop the build process if it's busy. Then set the target text to this text, and also set TMPro's text to it as well. Then just set the max visible characters to include every character in the text. If this architect is directly affecting the dialog system's TM-Pro object, then we should also update the target text of the dialog system to this value as well to avoid any potential future problem. This architect is related to the dialog system if its TM-Pro object is the same as the speech text object in the dialog system. Alright, good, and that pieced together the whole segment, but the next segment, which was supposed to append, acted as override. And this is because our whole dialog, which is set as the target of the text architect, is reset to nothing for each segment regardless of if it's additive or not. Instead, we should cast the last segment's whole dialog into the line itself and use that in the segments. There. Now, where we set it to an empty string, let's only do that if our pretext is false or empty. And access it from the line reference of this segment. Make sure we get the name right. Alright, and let's update these two references down here as well to match. So with that, force finishing in rapid succession should give us no problems. And it doesn't, so that is very good. Alright, but one thing I noticed is that when we skip and move to the next segment, skip is reset, but our characters per frame is not. So we're stuck at the skip amount, which I believe is 5, but this means our dialogue shows faster even when we don't want it to, unless we add an event to stop that. And that's because when we renew the architect, skip is set to false, but the speed and character limit carries from events over into new segments and lines. Consequently, if we skip and change that value, that still carries over as well. So we need to change that and make sure that it doesn't. Instead of using the character limit directly, let's add a new integer inside of the construction sequence called CPF, which is just characters per frame abbreviated. Set it to the character limit by default, and let's switch to using and changing CPF rather than the actual variable, so the character limit will only be affected inside of this function here. Now skip will only affect a single construction process. Also in our novel controller, while a segment is running and next is detected, the first click should mean we skip, and the second means we force finish. But unless I reset next, one click activates them both, so let me fix that by resetting next after each one. That's why one click was force finishing and I was never actually seeing the skip. Now, we probably want to trigger the next event by clicking the screen along with our keyboard, like you do in real visual novels. So let's go ahead and add some functionality for that right now. Remember that the next triggers the advancement to the next line of our chapter, so we should be able to click the screen to trigger it, but we don't just want to click anywhere. For instance, some buttons should supersede next with their own events. Because of this, let's make a button and remove the text and scale it to the size of the screen. This button will trigger next when it's clicked, but we'll only be able to click it if there's no other UI element in front of it. This is what will allow us to click other parts of the screen without triggering the next event, such as when we click buttons like we have on the side over there. If there is something over the next button that we don't want to interfere, such as our overlay panel, which lies over top of everything on our UI, we just need to set raycast target to false on whatever UI component it uses. That's typically the image component. That's actually the only one I've seen the raycast target on, so that might be the only one. Not sure. Just make sure that your layers won't interfere, and uncheck those raycast target booleans. The position of my next button will be on the dialog panel in front of the name and speech box, but behind my side buttons, so I can click anywhere but on a button to trigger the next event. Additionally, when we make a pause screen, that'll overlay the next button so it won't be able to be clicked when we pause. Now we just need to scale it to the size of the screen. Because it's before the buttons in my child hierarchy, it's drawn before them, and thus positioned behind them on the UI. If its placement were incorrect, it might cover some or all of my buttons, but I want it behind them all to limit the trigger field. Now just set it to be fully transparent so we can see our scene with no obstruction. And in the button component, add a click event that'll trigger the next event from our novel controller. My novel controller is on my core, so I'll drag that in here, choose novel controller, and make sure the triggered event is the next method. So therefore, by clicking invalid space, we can trigger next as we've been doing with our keyboard. Now just make sure the anchors are set to max so we can fit the screen at all times. And play. So here I can click these buttons, and they would trigger events without affecting the chapter, but as soon as I click a valid empty space, we'd advance to the next line. With all of that working, it's time to update our command file for our own personal reference. We never want to risk forgetting how things work, especially as our system becomes more and more complex with different features and functions we'll be adding in here. Using events opens doors of opportunity for what you can add into your novel, so think about some features that are important to your novel or something that would make it stand out. Make the event tags, handle them in the dialog events class, and log them in your command file. So now we have segmenters, instructions, injections, and actions, all usable from a single line of dialogue, so chapter files should be relatively easy to craft and edit on your part. In the next episode, we're going to be adding user input fields so people can name their character. So subscribe and stay tuned, and thank you guys for watching.